Frank Sinatra's voice cracked on the word tonight. And wait, because what broke his control wasn't the note. It was the man sitting 12 feet away in row 3. The man who'd spent 3 days telling anyone who'd listen that Frank's mother, well, let's just say he talked trash about Dolly Sinatra in ways that crossed every line. The spotlight held Sinatra's face for 3 seconds too long. The band kept playing. The room sensed something wrong. And then Frank Sinatra did something that would either destroy his career or prove exactly who he was. He stopped singing, dropped the microphone to his side, and walked straight to the edge of the stage. To understand what happened that night at the Sands Hotel in March 1969, you need to understand 2 things about Frank Sinatra. First, he wasn't Dean Martin. Dean had that easy, careless cool that let insults slide off like water. Frank felt everything, every slight, every disrespect, every whispered comment about his past, his family, his connections, burned into him like acid. Second, Frank's temper wasn't a rumor or an exaggeration for publicity. He'd punched photographers, shattered cameras, threatened reporters with physical violence, walked off stages mid-performance when something set him off. The difference between Frank's public image and Frank's actual rage: the image was carefully managed. The rage was real, immediate, and dangerous. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? The trouble had started 3 days earlier, though Frank didn't know it yet. An entertainment columnist named Morris Resnick had published a piece in a Los Angeles paper. Not a review, not an interview, just a gossip column item. 5 sentences. 4 of them were about Frank's mother, Dolly Sinatra. Her past running a boarding house in Hoboken that some people said was more than a boarding house. The 5th sentence suggested Frank's entire career had been built on mob money and family shame. Resnick had written it knowing exactly what he was doing. He'd been trying to get Frank's attention for 2 years, pitching interview requests that Frank's people ignored. So Resnick went nuclear. He wrote the one thing guaranteed to make Frank Sinatra lose his mind. By the time the column hit newsstands, copies were already circulating backstage at the Sands. Frank's manager, a careful man named Hank Sinicola, saw it first. He immediately pulled every copy he could find, told the staff not to mention it. Frank was in the middle of a 2-week residency at the Sands. 28 shows. The room was sold out every night. Sanicola's job was to keep Frank focused, calm, and professional until the residency ended. Then they could deal with Resnick. But here's what Sanicola didn't know. Morris Resnick had bought a front-row table for Friday night's show, and he'd told 3 people in the casino about it. Knowing word would spread, Frank's dressing room at the Sands was sparse. A couch, a mirror, a small bar cart. Frank didn't like clutter when he was preparing to perform. He needed space to think, to run through the set list in his head, to get into the right headspace. On March 21st, 1969, at approximately 7:45 p.m., Frank was sitting on the couch in a white undershirt and tuxedo pants, going over lyrics in his mind. There was a knock. Sanicola opened the door. A man Frank barely recognized, one of the pit bosses, stood in the hallway, looking uncomfortable. Frank noticed the expression immediately. Something was wrong. "What?" Frank said. The pit boss hesitated. "Mr. Sinatra, I thought you should know. Morris Resnick is here tonight. Table 4, row 3. Frank's face didn't change. He looked at Sanicola. "Who's Morris Resnick?" Sanicola closed his eyes. "Nobody, Frank. Just a columnist." "What column?" "It doesn't matter. He's nobody." Frank stood up. "What column?" The room went quiet. Listen carefully to what happened next, because this is when Frank Sinatra's legendary control started to crack. Sanicola pulled a folded newspaper page from his jacket pocket. He'd been carrying it for 3 days, hoping he'd never have to show it. He handed it to Frank without a word. Frank read it, standing in the middle of the room. His jaw tightened. His hands started shaking. When he finished, he folded the paper very carefully, set it on the bar cart, and said in a voice that was almost calm, "Get him out of the hotel." "Frank, I can't do that. He bought a ticket." "Then refund his ticket. Get him out. We can't just throw out a customer without cause. It'll be a story. Sinatra ejects journalist. It's exactly what he wants." Frank walked to the mirror and stared at his reflection. 20 seconds passed. Nobody spoke. Then Frank picked up his dress shirt and started putting it on. "Fine," he said quietly. "He can stay." Sanicola felt relief for exactly 4 seconds. Then Frank added, "But if I see him, I'm walking off that stage, and I'm not coming back." At 8:30 p.m., Frank Sinatra walked through the backstage entrance to the Copa Room at the Sands Hotel. The room held 1,800 people that night, every seat filled. The orchestra was in position. The lighting director waited for his cue. Frank stood in the wings, looking out at the crowd, scanning the front rows. He found Morris Resnick immediately. Table 4, row 3, dead center. Resnick was in his mid-40s, soft around the middle, wearing a suit that was slightly too nice for a columnist's salary. He was smiling, talking to the woman next to him, completely relaxed. Frank stared at him for 30 seconds. Then he turned to his conductor, a man named Bill Miller, and said, "Let's go." The lights dropped. The room went silent. Then the spotlight hit center stage, and Frank Sinatra walked into it. The audience erupted. Frank didn't smile. He lifted the microphone from its stand and nodded to Miller. The orchestra started with "I've Got You Under My Skin." Frank's voice was perfect, smooth, controlled. Every note precise. But notice what the people in the first 5 rows saw. Frank's eyes kept drifting to table 4. Just quick glances. Morris Resnick sat there watching, that same slight smile on his face. After the second song, Frank spoke to the audience for the first time. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Sands. We've got some beautiful music for you tonight, and I hope you're all in the mood to listen." His voice was steady, professional, but his hand gripped the microphone stand too tightly. The third song was "Fly Me to the Moon," Frank's signature, a song he'd performed thousands of times. But halfway through the second verse, something shifted. His eyes locked on Resnick for just a moment too long, and the rage he'd been suppressing pushed through. His breathing changed. The next line came out slightly off-tempo. He recovered, but he knew. And Resnick, that smile still on his face, knew too. The fourth song was "The Lady is a Tramp." Frank was 2 verses in when it happened. He was singing about loving the free, fresh wind in his hair, and on the word "tonight," his voice cracked. Not much, just a slight break in tone. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Frank noticed, and he knew why it happened. He'd glanced at Morris Resnick at exactly the wrong moment, and the rage had affected his breathing. Frank stopped singing. The orchestra continued for 3 bars, then trailed off into silence. Frank stood center stage, microphone at his side, staring at row 3. The audience started to murmur. Something was clearly wrong, but nobody knew what. Frank's face was expressionless. But wait, look at his shoulders. They were rising and falling too fast. His breathing was off. Morris Resnick shifted in his seat, suddenly less comfortable. Frank took 2 steps toward the front of the stage. The murmuring stopped. Absolute silence. Then Frank said, his voice carrying perfectly through the room without the microphone, "You know what I hate? Pause. I hate people who smile in your face while they stab you in the back." He pointed directly at Resnick. "You, stand up." Resnick's face went pale. He didn't move. Frank's voice got louder. "I said stand up." Nicola was backstage, watching through a gap in the curtain. He turned to the stage manager. "Get security ready. This is about to go bad." Resnick slowly stood. The room was frozen. 1,800 people holding their breath. Frank walked to the very edge of the stage. You got something to say about my mother? Pause. Say it to me. Right now. Say it. His voice was shaking with rage. Morris Resnick opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Frank threw the microphone onto the stage. The crash echoed through the room. I'll make this easy for you. Pause. I'm coming down there, and you're going to repeat everything you wrote, every word, to my face. Frank jumped off the stage. He didn't climb down. He jumped, landing 6 feet from Resnick's table. Remember what the people in that room described later: Frank Sinatra in full evening wear, face red, fists clenched, advancing on a terrified journalist, while 1,800 people watched in absolute silence. 2 security guards burst from the wings, grabbed Frank by the arms. He shoved them back, not violently, but firmly, and kept moving toward Resnick. Say it, Frank said again. Tell me what kind of woman my mother was. Come on. Resnick was shaking. Mr. Sinatra, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I shouldn't have. You're damn right you shouldn't have. But you did. Pause. So now you're gonna apologize. Not to me, to her. Frank pulled a piece of paper from his jacket pocket, threw it at Resnick. It was Resnick's own column. Read it out loud. The whole thing. Let everyone hear what you wrote. One of the security guards, a man named Charlie Malone, who'd worked with Frank before, moved between them. Frank, he said quietly. Not like this. You know this isn't the way. Frank's eyes were locked on Resnick, and for a moment it looked like he was going to go through Malone to get to him. His breathing was rapid. His fists were white-knuckled. But listen to what happened in that pause. The orchestra conductor, Bill Miller, started playing softly. Just piano, a gentle version of One for My Baby. It was Frank's signal, the song they used when things went wrong. When Frank needed a moment. Frank heard it, stopped, closed his eyes. When he opened them, the rage was still there, but the eruption had passed. He pointed at Resnick one more time. You're done. You don't write about me, my family, or anyone I know ever again. Resnick nodded frantically. Yes, yes, I understand. Get out. Resnick grabbed his coat and left, stumbling over chairs. The woman who'd been with him followed. The security guards stayed close to Frank, but he wasn't looking at Resnick anymore. He was standing in the middle of the audience section, breathing hard, trying to regain control. The room stayed silent. Then someone in the back started clapping. Slowly, others joined. Within 10 seconds, the entire room was applauding. Frank looked up, surprised. He walked back to the stage, this time using the stairs, picked up the microphone, and said, his voice hoarse, "Sorry about that, folks. Sometimes a man's gotta handle his business." The audience laughed, a release of tension. Frank turned to the orchestra. Let's try that again. From the top. They played for another 90 minutes. Frank sang everything. Standards, ballads, swingers. And then, near the end of the night, he did something he rarely did in 1969. He performed My Way. The song had only been released a few months earlier. It wasn't yet the anthem it would become. But that night, after what had just happened, every word hit differently. I've lived a life that's full. I traveled each and every highway. His voice was rougher than usual. The emotion still close to the surface. But that rawness made the performance electric. When he got to the line, "I did it my way," he looked directly at where Resnick had been sitting, the empty table, and he held that note longer than usual. People who were there said it was one of the most powerful shows they'd ever seen, not because of the songs, but because they'd witnessed something real, a moment when the carefully constructed image cracked and the man underneath came through. After the show, Frank sat in his dressing room alone. Senecola came in. "You okay?" Frank was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I almost lost it, Hank. I was gonna hit him, right there in front of everyone, but you didn't. Because of Bill. If he hadn't started playing." Frank shook his head. That was too close. Senecola sat down. You know what this is gonna do for you? Every paper in the country's gonna cover this. Sinatra defends mother's honor. You're gonna look like a hero. I don't care how it looks. He talked trash about my mother, Hank. You expect me to just smile and sing? No, Sinicola said. I don't. And neither does anyone who was in that room tonight. They saw a man who draws a line and doesn't let people cross it. That's not something you can fake. But then Sanicola's expression changed. Frank, there's something else. What? There were reporters in the audience tonight. At least 3 that I know of. This is going to be front page tomorrow. Frank was silent for a moment. Then he said, Good. Let them write it. Let everyone know. You come after my family. You deal with me. Directly. The story spread fast. By the next morning, it was in every entertainment column and news brief across the country. Most of the coverage was sympathetic to Frank. The journalist who'd attacked a man's mother got what was coming to him. Frank Sinatra had shown restraint by not actually hitting him. But there were also quieter discussions happening backstage in Las Vegas. Discussions about whether Frank's temper was finally becoming too much of a liability, whether he could be trusted to keep control when things got personal. The Sands management called a meeting. They asked Frank's team if this was going to be a pattern. Sinicola assured them it wouldn't be. But privately, he wasn't so sure. Frank completed his residency at the Sands without incident. But the tension was there. The staff walked on eggshells. Everyone wondering if another explosion was coming. It never did. Frank kept his word. He performed. He was professional. He drew huge crowds. But something had changed. Morris Resnick never wrote about Frank Sinatra again. In fact, Resnick left entertainment journalism entirely within 6 months, moved to Florida, worked in his brother's real estate business. He never publicly discussed what happened that night. When asked years later by a colleague, he said only, I learned a valuable lesson about the difference between writing something and saying it to someone's face. Frank Sinatra never apologized for the incident. When reporters asked him about it, he said, A man has the right to defend his family. If that makes me difficult to work with, find someone else to sell out your rooms. But those who worked with Frank closely noticed a subtle change after that night. He was more aware of how quickly his temper could spiral. He started walking away from provocations instead of confronting them, not because he was afraid, but because he'd seen how close he'd come to destroying everything he'd built over one worthless columnist. The microphone Frank threw on stage that night was retired. The Sands staff kept it in a case backstage. With a small plaque, Frank Sinatra, March 21, 1969. It became a reminder to everyone who worked there. Frank Sinatra wasn't acting when he sang about heartbreak, betrayal, or fighting back against a world that tried to break you. He lived it. And on the rare occasions when that raw emotion broke through the professional veneer, it was unforgettable. Years later, a young singer asked Frank for advice about dealing with critics. Frank said, The critics don't matter. The audience matters. Your family matters. Everything else is noise. Then he paused. But if someone crosses the line and makes it personal, you draw a line right back. You do it once, you do it clearly, and you make sure they never forget it. Another pause. That's not anger. That's self-respect. That's the real story of the night. Frank Sinatra nearly lost control on stage. Not because he was unprofessional. Not because he couldn't handle pressure. But because someone attacked what mattered most to him and expected him to smile and sing anyway. Frank didn't smile. He drew his line, and everyone in that room understood exactly where it was.